Mark's early development, spiritual development, came from his family, which was actively engaged in the United Methodist Church. After graduating from the University of Illinois, Mark moved to New York State, where he took a job managing the Outdoor Education Center for SUNY at Brockport. After 7 years in the position, he met Elaine, and in 1982 they were married. Mark then started his training and consulting work in the human resources field. Elaine and Mark began applying their accelerated learning tools of NLP to the teaching of spiritual development practices through their modeling course known as Spiritual Insight Training. In 1988, along with Dr. and Mrs. Panabianco, Elaine and Mark founded Fellowships of the Spirit and its School of Spiritual Healing and Prophecy. Mark's interest in the public service brought him to be elected to the Pomfret Town Board in 1991, and he served as Chautauqua County's executive for 2 terms. Since 2007, Mark has returned to his original career as the director of the Western District of New York State Parks. In this capacity, Mark served as the administrator of 40 state facilities over 10 Western New York counties. Over the years, Mark's passionate desire for spiritual development has brought him to study Verdict, Taoist, and mystical Christian teachings with a variety of teachings and writers from around the world. He currently teaches classes in advanced mediumship practices in the School of Spiritual Healing and Prophecy and to its graduates. And I wanted a dynamic speaker to open up our first service here at the Assembly Hall, and Mark is surely that. He's a great support of the Church Living Spirit. Elaine and Emmy were great friends and went in 1988 and formed these 2 independent spiritualist churches that are still very popular and profitable, not profitable, I don't know where that came from. Prosperous, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you so much. Prosperous today. So without further ado, Mark Thomas.
Good morning, good morning. I don't teach mediumship meditation.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about today, meditation. So, yeah. Hey, it's great to see everybody again. Isn't it great to be back home in your church home and celebrating the change of seasons? It's so much with us already, and it's a festive day. It's an enjoyable day, and thank you, Nancy, for the invitation to open your fall season. And so I'm glad to be here and glad to do that with you all. You know, last time I was here and I spoke a lot about Elaine and her journey, and today I'm going to talk about my journey a little bit and how I got to where I am, not so much from the bio that Nancy just read, but from the spiritual walk and what's been key things that's made such a big difference for me in my life. So often I do get questions, so you seem to always just teach about meditation. I said, yeah, I kind of do. I do that a lot. And you also make reference to Gandhi a lot, and I said, yeah, guilty again. I reference Gandhi quite a bit. So my talk today is going to shed a little light on both of those 2 things. First of all, in 1976, when I moved to New York State, I learned Transcendental Meditation, or TM, and I'll reference it as TM from the rest of my talk on it because it's a mouthful to keep saying it through the whole talk. I was at Brockport. One of the college students there taught me TM and was one of the TM teachers, and that was probably the biggest turning point in my life, and I don't overstate that. If I look back over my life and I say, you know, what's the biggest shift or change? It was that. It was that moment. It was that moment when I dropped into that deep, deep silence within that I knew was there, but never knew how to get there, except by a few recreational chemicals. From that moment on, I didn't need recreational chemicals because I could get there myself. It was a blessed moment in my life. I began studying at that point an incredible amount of work, both in the TM movement, their courses that they had, but also through other teachers in other traditions. I went to the Abbey of the Genesee regularly, south of Rochester, a Trappist monastery where they don't talk most of the time. They live in silence. And those monks would come down to the guest house, the retreat house, each week, and they would do a lesson daily. They would come out of their silence to talk with us. And they had a profound influence on me because I found out a whole lot about mystical teachings in the religious traditions I grew up in Christianity that I didn't even know existed. They opened my eyes to so much there. But the Taoist teachings, the Buddhist teachings, the Vedic teachings, all of those became much more in front of me as I learned and studied deeply over the next couple of years. One of the things that I learned from one of the TM courses was something called the Einstein effect, which is a very powerful teaching, if you know about it. And that is that if Einstein came up with this theory, physics theory, back in the 20s, I believe, was when he first conceived it, that if you could take a space, like take a sphere, right, and suck everything out of it, they call it a vacuum state. You remove particles, waves, everything is gone from that space, if you could theoretically create such. And then if you introduce particles into that space, reintroduce into that space, and you introduce motion into, at the time they were theoretically looking at 2% of the particles in that system, that the entire system will move into that order. Far from majority rule, 2%. And as they tested that theory out through time, they found it was really only 1%. That's a profound piece of information, folks. When you start to think about what's 1% of your day, we'll get into that in a couple of minutes. You don't have to turn your life inside out, upside down, and devote massive amounts of life shift to be able to affect systemic change inside yourself. So this interesting character, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi from India, who was the source of the TM teachings, he had a degree in physics. And one of the things that he came across in his study in physics was this concept, this Einstein concept. So he said, what would happen if we got 1% of the population in the area meditating on a daily basis? What would the effect be? So they did some experimentation. They went to Rhode Island, a community there. They hit it hard with TM teachers, and they got to the 1% effect. But before they did that, they did some research. They established a baseline of what were the truancy rates, what were the disease rates in the hospital admissions, what was the crime rates of various categories of crime. And they looked at those prior to going into that community. And then once they hit that 1%, they did the test, the check-in again. And you know what happened? The truancy rates dropped way down. The crime rates dropped down. The hospital admissions went down. The death rate dropped. There were so many factors that shifted in that community. That's the good news. You know what the bad news was? When they pulled out and they stopped teaching and folks drifted away, all those numbers went right back where they were before. Fascinating. They also did a project in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. The government, the colonial government of Rhodesia, called Maharishi's folks in and established that 1% effect. And it was one of the few African nations that had a transition from the colonial rule to self-rule of the indigenous populations without a war. It was a much more smooth transition. They maintained that 1% effect throughout that transition. India was in trouble in 1979. Political assassinations. The government was on the verge of collapse. The economy was in real trouble. It was a time in my life where my first marriage had ended. We had a 2-year-old son. But at that moment, when Maharishi put the call out and said, please, we need meditators from all over the world to come to New Delhi for a month to help stabilize this country, I went. I got to be part of one of those world peace projects, and it worked. India stabilized in that month, and also at that time, so they didn't have the relapse effect, they sent out folks all over India to get folks meditating, and what ended up happening was they were able to sustain the fabric of the country. It did turn around, and it was quite remarkable to be a part of one of those projects, to be on the inside of it. It was not easy. While I was there, well, back up a little bit. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, had been missionaries in India, and my mother lived the first 6 years of her life in India. As a child of mission parents, Methodists. And my grandfather knew Gandhi. This was the 1930s. Gandhi was in the height of his time there of working towards the liberation of a whole subcontinent through nonviolent means. My mother, who's still with us at 96 and rolling along, says to say hi to you, Dorothy. She grew up in the environment knowing about Gandhi as a child. When she became an adult here in the United States, and she knew that Martin Luther King was working with those same practices that Gandhi used in his nonviolent social reform, racial reform here in our own country. Mom got involved with the civil rights movement in our community, but she had put books in front of me when I was in high school about Gandhi. So I knew about him. Of course, I knew about King very well too, because that's the time I was living through. And I knew about her efforts. Well, back to when I was in India, my last week that I was there of the month, we were told not to leave the course, just stay there and just meditate during the day. And all day long, we'd have talks by Maharishi in the evening, and just stay focused. Well, one late afternoon after our meditations were done and before dinner, I took a walk because I knew the historic site, which was the cremation site of Gandhi, was 2 blocks away from where we were all meditating in the building we were staying with. And as I walked to that site, I saw poverty I have never seen before or since. Third world poverty ain't first world poverty, folks. And that's not to say that first world poverty isn't awful, because it is for those that are going through it here in our own backyards, in our own communities, in this county, and all around us. It's there. The third world poverty is extreme. And it really, really touched my heart as I walked through those neighborhoods and saw people whose whole lives were living out of cardboard boxes, eating whatever they could from the gutters. I walked into this historic site where Gandhi had been cremated, and there's this incredible message engraved in the stone of the monument. I want to read it to you this morning, because it was so transformative for me, and I think it might be for you as well. It reads this way: I will give you a talisman. Whenever you are in doubt, or when the self becomes too much with you, apply the following test. Recall the face of the poorest and most helpless man or woman whom you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him or her. Will they be able to gain anything by what you do? Will it restore them to control over their own life and their own destiny? In other words, will it lead to freedom for the hungry and spiritually starved millions? Then you will find your doubts and yourself melting away. I kind of sat down and took that in. Where I just walked through, why I came to India, came right front and center to me. I knew right away what had called me to India and how important it was to be there. India turned around at that point. Yes, they still have poverty galore. That nation has grown, though, dramatically since the 70s when I was there. It has prospered in many ways. When I was at Niagara Falls, one of our biggest visitation groups was folks from India. I used to get to watch them come in because they now have a middle class in India. They would travel with 4 generations to the falls. The great-grandparents, the grandparents, the parents, and the young children in tow. And I got to tell you, those seniors would sprint for the falls. This was a trip of a lifetime. And I saw that all summer long for 11 years. It's remarkable to watch people at the falls because they will sprint to get there, but they never sprint away. They saunter away from Niagara Falls. They take a long, slow walk back. Before I left India, I had a conversation with Maharishi. And I asked him, should I become a TM teacher? And he said, no. But he said, your work this lifetime is teaching meditation and spiritual practices. And I was far from that at that point. And I was very puzzled. And he laughingly, which he would do quite often, look at you and say, go home. The path will unfold for you. Well, I went home sick from parasites. I had lost 30 pounds in that month. And it took some pretty heavy duty meds to get that out of my system. But I turned around. And throughout that illness, I was buoyed up by that conversation with Maharishi. And I was puzzled as can be. Because it's like, I'm just working at the Outdoor Ed Center. I'm doing my daily meditations and taking care of my son when he's with us. But I didn't know what was up next. Then I met that woman. You remember that woman named Elaine? Yeah, you all know her. Well, that started a journey together that things changed incrementally. It wasn't like an overnight shift of things. It moved over decades. But yeah, that role of teaching meditation and other spiritual practices, yeah, it unfolded, but it unfolded alongside with Elaine. And it was a good journey, a very good journey. But it was really that Maharishi telling me that day that really opened my eyes to the possibility of that direction. At a time when I really did need it badly. I was in between marriages, co-parenting our 2-year-old son and trying to figure out where life was going to take me next. You know, folks, it is a contrast that we can walk in a building like this and worship and commune. It's so good to be back together again in the season of the fall, in a season of abundance, where we reap the harvest. And we can take that for granted. And we can also get really wrapped up in the angst that's in our world today. And there's plenty of that. There's so much of that right now. There's an increasing, in spite of our capacity to communicate electronically, there's increasing isolation, separation, polarization, hatred, nationalism, bigotry, poverty, loneliness, and its very near cousin disease in the world in which we're hanging. As Gandhi would say, it's up to each of us to make the difference we want to see in this world. It's on us. When you know more, you're called to do more. You know the term responsibility? We make it one word, but it's really two words. Responsibility. We have the ability to respond. We have the ability to do things better. We have the ability to make things better. Not only for ourselves, especially not just for ourselves, but for this world in which we're walking. That's in our hand. There's a passage from Luke that always touched me when I was young. It says this, "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the ones who have been entrusted with much, much more will be asked." That's a call for us to step into change, embrace change, but the kind of change, it's not harmful change, but is change that is uplifting, inspiring, and can make the difference in the world. So here he goes. If you're not committed to a daily practice of meditation, what's holding you back? That's not a rhetorical question, folks. That's in your backyard. Now I'm going to go back to what I talked about earlier. You know what 1% of your day is? 14 and a half minutes. If you can't find 14 and a half minutes in the day long you got to find and devote to meditation, if you got to break it up into 5 and 4.5, or 7.5 and 7, whatever it takes to get that done, what's in your way? You got all the other distractions in the world we've got today. It doesn't require you to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Get her done, as the comedian would say. Stop putting it off. Look at the world today. The need is great. The hour is now. Make the choices. We get in our lives what we prefer. And if you prefer a different set of happenings in your own life, but if you prefer a different set of happenings in the world in which we walk, get it done. Get on with it. It'll make that difference. And if you don't know how, seek out folks who can help you get there. To establish a daily meditative practice, our world depends on that. It does indeed. And then the next step is engage. The next step, don't get these out of sequence. The sequence matters. Engage lovingly and compassionately in this world. Love uncontainably. Out there, get it out there. I don't use that term unconditionally. I use the term uncontainably. That means let her rip, let it go. Stop holding love in, express it, and let it go without measure. The world depends on that. Indeed, it does. And then the last thing I have for you to consider getting it on with is from the prophet of old days, the Hebrew prophet Micah. Words that you've heard before, but I'll utter them again as I close. Act justly. Love mercifully. And walk humbly with your God. Have a blessed fall day, and let's keep this love that we have in our hearts flowing out, Let's make the difference. Let's be the difference makers. Let's celebrate the blessings and the richness of this great land that we have. And let's share it. Let's magnify that. so that those who don't feel that and don't have that have a piece of what you got, because you can share it. Have a lovely day.